Good morning. My name is Dan Kimmel, and I'm going to be reading a short story from the forthcoming anthology called On Time from Transmundane Press. This was an interesting challenge for me because I had just written my second novel, Time on My Hands, My Misadventures in Time Travel. And there was a minor character in it that I wanted to spin off into a story. And I wanted to write a story that you didn't have to have read the novel for the story to work. But if you had, it fits in. So here is the story. It's called There's No Time Like Home. With his fringe of white hair around his bald head and his equally white beard, Court might have seemed like an old man in many eras. However, with the youth treatments available in the 22nd century, his smooth facial features made him seem ageless. Even the other members of his marital collective, the other 7 partners with whom he had formed a familial bond, couldn't say for certain just how old he was. He had recently had his annual medical scan, and the doctor interpreting the data said he was in fine health, although he could stand to lose some weight. Court might not have realized it, but it was a recommendation that had stood the test of time, having been invoked by centuries of medical professionals. In any event, while he could expect to thrive for several decades to come, he had hit the mandatory retirement age and would soon have to give up his job. It wasn't so much that he was too old as that so much labor was automated that limiting tenure for most professions ensured there would be openings for younger applicants. Court understood the reasons for the policy, but had only started thinking about what he would do with the rest of his life. Having showered after a robust morning of physical, mental, spiritual, and sexual exercise, Court headed to his dressing room to get dressed for his final day of work. As a time portal officer, his uniform, such as it was designed in such a way as to give no indication whatsoever about life in the 22nd century. In his brown robe of somewhat coarse material, cinched by a cord tied around his waist, he had been told he looked like a medieval monk. A visit to the 7th century while he was a university student allowed him to see the model for his garb, and he could see why it had been selected. It was humble and nondescript, revealing little of his actual life and times, while also appearing non-threatening to the time travelers with whom he came into contact. That was important because it was his job to give them the disappointing news that they had traveled too far into the future and would not be able to get beyond the waiting room where he met them. According to the Price principles, derived by Wilfred Price, the father of time travel, the device used for temporal jaunts could be used to explore the past within certain limits, such as not going back to the same time more than once, which helped avert paradoxes. However, when it came to travel into the future, there were hard limits which Court couldn't fully understand, but was bound to enforce. Any attempt to go beyond a century ahead from one's own time led you into a nondescript limbo where a temporal officer, such as Court, would genially explain why one could not do so and how such actions might void the warranty on the device. What he had learned in his training was that this was an iron law of time travel. A person simply could not go too far into the future. The theory being that this was a check on acquiring knowledge that might inalterably change the past. He knew there were some things that could be changed, but this blocking served the purpose of keeping time flowing in the proper direction. Court went to the locker room at the Temporal Port Authority and removed all the devices that might have revealed too much to a clever visitor from the past. He then headed to the Guardian Lounge and awaited his first call. It wouldn't take long. They would usually get several visitors from the late 21st century on a given day, usually people who couldn't be bothered to read the user's manual before turning on the device. The limitations on future travel were spelled out in detail, but Price's design was so easy and intuitive to use that many people just charged up the batteries and took it out for a spin. Court had barely had time to settle in when he was pinged by the dispatcher. Court to waiting room B, woman from 2077, attempting to skip ahead several centuries. All in a day's work, Court said to himself, knowing this might be the last time he'd be called into action. He tapped his device, which was preset with the necessary coordinates, and popped over. As always, it was serene and nondescript, vaguely smelling of the sea, although there was no water to be seen. A young dark-skinned woman was looking around somewhat confused. "Hello there," Court called out to her. She noticed him with a start. "Who are you?" "I'm Court. I'm here to help people who have gone off on the wrong time path." "What wrong path?" "You're from 2077. He glanced at her device and saw she had set it for several hundred years into her future. "I take it you didn't read the instructions." "This is my brother's. He said I could use it while he was away." "Ah, I see," said Court, not really seeing how it mattered. And of course, it didn't. He'd explained to her what the problem was and sent her back on her way. "Well, you should ask him to let you take a look at the manual, assuming he kept it." Now look, Mr. Court." No, it's just Court. And you are?" "Monique." "Monique, what a lovely name. I haven't heard that one before." He smiled benevolently, trying to indicate that this was not a serious problem, more of a clerical error. "Well, the situation is this. People are not allowed to travel more than a century into the future on their timeline. It's nothing personal, it just is." Monique seemed to be considering this information. Looking at Court, she said, "And you're telling me this because—" Court was half curious. It was wait, wrong page. Here we go. "Because it's my job. I work for the Time Portal Authority." Sort of like a bus station?" "Well, I suppose, although I'm not quite sure what a bus is." "So there are no buses in your time. How do people get around?" Court tried to look authoritative. "Now look, Monique, if you can't go into the far future, why do you think you can get information about it through other means? That's the whole point. You can see a bit of the future, but no more. That's just the way it works. Now, you really should be on your way. I'm sure there are plenty of times you could visit that you'll find just as fascinating." "Well, what about you? Do you get to go into the far future? Do you get a special pass?" The question startled Court. What sort of time did she come from where the rules didn't apply to everyone? "Well, of course not. Read the manual. You'll get the whole story." "And you spend all your time blocking people's way into the future and never thought of checking it out for yourself?" Court sighed. He could try to explain that it didn't work that way, but he didn't think he would be able to convince her, at least not with her present state of knowledge. So he was left with the one thing that got most people moving. Putting on his stern face, he looked right at her and said, "Monique, you've got to get moving now. The very structure of the space-time continuum is in danger of collapsing in on itself." He pressed a button hidden in his uniform, and all of a sudden, a siren went off. "Warning, warning, 60 seconds to space-time implosion. Evacuate the area immediately." Monique froze, unclear what to do. Court pointed to the return button on her device, which she pressed, instantly vanishing. He hit the hidden button in his uniform, and the siren and the announcements instantly ceased. "I hate when I have to do that," he said, to no one in particular. There was a little farewell party when his shift ended, and then a somewhat glum Court went home, not sure what he was going to do with his time now. After dinner with the collective, he announced that he needed some alone time. He had spent his working life enforcing the price principles, but had never really tested them himself. Was it possible to bend or break the rules? He took out his own device. It was a graduation gift that was trimmed in blue and yellow, his school's colors, and set the course for 101 years into the future. He was in a very familiar limbo, only now he was the traveler being stopped, and it was someone else who was approaching, dressed in the familiar cassock. Court was half curious if the standard greeting had changed in a century, but also disappointed that his adventure would be over so soon. The Time Portal Authority guardian did not immediately speak, but instead just stared at Court, looking as if he wasn't sure what to do. He was a pleasant-looking middle-aged fellow, but he seemed to be at a loss for words. Court hoped that humanity hadn't so evolved at this point that people communicated by telepathy. The last thing he expected was what happened next. "Grandpa, Court?" It took a moment for Court to recover his own ability to speak. Finally, he blurted out, "Do I know you?" "Is it really you, Grandpa Court? I'm Garn, your grandson." "I don't have any grandson named Garn." The younger man took Court's arm and turned it to reveal the settings on his device. "I see what the problem is. I wasn't born until 20 years after the time you've come from. You haven't met me yet." Court couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Garn made a gesture and a couple of chairs appeared. Please, Grandpa Court, sit down. I'm so happy to see you. The two men sat as the vague, not quite mist rolled around them. You're my grandson? Yes, and we were very close. In fact, you inspired me to join the Time Portal Authority. Garn seemed to be tearing up. He took a deep breath and finally said, what are you doing here? Court sighed. I reached mandatory retirement age and didn't know what to do with myself, so I thought I'd see how far into the future I could get before I was stopped. Apparently, the rules apply to everyone. I remember you talking about this. You said every life should have a purpose. But when I knew you, you seemed to be at peace. There was a long silence between them, and then Garn stood. Grandpa Court, give me a moment. I'll be right back. Court found himself alone as Garn winked out of sight, but he was back a few moments later. Such was the paradox of time travel that a person could leave for what was only a moment to the person left behind, but could be ages for the person who had departed. Court looked up at his purported grandson and then noticed he was not alone. In fact, in short order, dozens of people arrived. They were of all ages, but they all seemed to have something in common. Grandpa Court, said Garn, I want you to meet your descendants. Court stood up as the new arrivals came up to embrace him and announced just how far from the future they had come. It spanned several centuries. Court turned to Garn. I don't understand. How could you go so far into the future when I can't? Well, I can't either. But there's a loophole in the price principles that we prefer not to talk about. I can go 100 years into the future to one of my descendants and ask him or her to go a century forward to their descendants and so forth, passing along the request that they travel back into the past to this time and place. Court took a moment to digest this. We're not supposed to be able to discover much about what's to come lest we disrupt the timeline. But if a group of people across the centuries chose to communicate with each other, they could get around the limits. Exactly, said a young woman who had identified herself as his great-great-great-great-granddaughter, Brix. That's why this family reunion had to be carefully and quietly arranged. Court looked at her. So I can't ask you what stocks I should be investing in that will pay off down the road? A teenager from several centuries later burst out laughing. You mean you still have capitalism? What's capitalism? Asked a young boy. Is that like when my mother texts me with the caps lock on? The teenager turned to the boy. You still have texting? What are you, from the 23rd century? People, Garn shouted, commanding everyone's attention. You all know the rules regarding conveying future information to the past. If you're more than a century or so ahead from someone else, it's not allowed. I know, shouted out a man dressed in a similar cassock. The whole space-time continuum will be in danger of collapsing in on itself. This brought a roar of laughter across the crowd. Court turned to Garn and quietly said, I don't know what to say. I'm overwhelmed. Grandpa Court, you don't have to say anything. You were a big influence in my life and that of other family members. And that influence was passed down through the generations. The chance to express our gratitude and love is all we ask. It's impossible to say how long they were all together, with everyone wanting their moment with Court. When a baby was placed in his arms and he was told the girl would be able to trace her ancestry back to him, although she no longer lived on Earth almost a millennia into the future, Court kissed her gently on the forehead and muttered a prayer intended to be heard only by the two of them. It was clearly the culmination of this extraordinary gathering. One by one, his descendants made their farewells and returned to their own times. At long last, it was just Court and Garn. I can't thank you enough, said Court. I look forward to your being born. I don't think I'm breaking any rules by saying we have some special times together. And would it be possible for you to come back to visit me as an adult? Garn seemed to consider the invitation for a moment and then said, I suppose I'll have to see if I can make the time. There was a brief silence, and then Court burst out laughing, quickly joined by Garn. I can't believe you're still using that old joke. The classics endure, Grandpa Court. That's what you taught me. They embraced and then stepped back. Court took one last look at his grandson and then hit the return button on his device. He might not get to go to the promised land, but it no longer mattered. He had seen the future, and it worked. So that's my story. I guess we have a few minutes if anybody has any questions or comments. And I'm relying on other people to get them to me. Okay, just checking right. Nothing right now. I taught college for like something like 25 years. I'm used to stunning the room into silence. Well, I'm not going to read anymore because we only have a few minutes left, but as long as I'm here, I should plug my other books. Besides the one that I was nominated for a Hugo for, which is another way of saying I didn't win it, Jar Jar Binks Must Die, which is a collection of my essays on science fiction movies. I've written two other novels. One is, it's a secret, a novel about aliens, Hollywood, and the Bartender's Guide, which is about the first space alien who wants to be a movie star. And my latest is Father of the Bride of Frankenstein, in which the monster not only marries into a Jewish family, but decides to convert. So I ask people who've read them if it made them laugh out loud, and they say these books do, and I go, then I've done my job. Okay, yes, and I'm on a panel at 2 o'clock this afternoon about aliens because of my alien book, and I'm on a panel on Jews and science fiction on Sunday at 11 a.m. So those are my two other appearances at the con. We all want to be on the other side of this and, be safe and have a vaccine and be able to have real conventions again. I had really been looking forward to coming to Columbus, and people who I guess know Ohio go, why do you want to go to Columbus? And I go, because it would have been a chance for me to go to the James Thurber house. James Thurber, the humorist who was an influence on me, and I have no reason to be in Columbus, but coming for the convention. So I'm hoping there will be another Columbus convention of some sort someday that I'll be able to attend, maybe as movie critic guest of honor, hint, hint, and I'll get to see it. In any case, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of the person who's handling the technical side of this, but I could not have done this without you. So thank you very much. Hope we'll cross paths again. Take care. Have a good day. Have a fun con.